Welcome to That Annuity Show, the podcast that will make you an expert in explaining annuities to your clients. Give us 30 minutes each week and we'll shave hours from your client presentations. Now, here's your host, Paul Tyler.
Hi, this is Paul Tyler, and welcome to another episode of That Annuity Show. And we have our full house with all of our regular hosts and co-hosts. I don't know, however we call each other. Ramsey, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be back.
Will, good to have you.
Always a pleasure.
Mark, and hey, listen, this last weekend you're making some great music. Thanks for sharing that.
Absolutely. Thank you. It was a lot of fun doing that over the weekend.
Yeah, we'll have to run that into a couple of these episodes and have some good music in the back again. So you got to send more of them. Hey, well, today we're talking about an absolutely important topic, and that is healthcare. I think when I look back over brochures explaining the needs for retirement planning, I think the industry itself I think we could have done a better job over the years positioning annuities and what they're being used for. We see boats, we see homes, we see vacations, when really, the biggest expense in retirement for a lot of people is just paying for healthcare. And today we've got a great guest, Jack Towarnicky. Jack, I hope I said your name correctly, with a researcher with the American Retirement Association, and just an expert on this topic. So Jack, welcome.
Thank you.
And did I get your name? Did I pronounce your name correctly, please?
I think you said Jack very accurately. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jack. Well, why don't you just give us a little bit of your background? You have a little bit is a lot, because you bring a lot of expertise to the table throughout a very interesting career.
Sure. So again, my name's Jack Towarnicky. Thank you very much for allowing me to be part of this group today. I've got 40 years of corporate employee benefits experience, 31 of those years in a plan sponsor role at 4 different Fortune 500 firms. Since I left my last plan sponsor role, I've been working primarily in consulting, employee benefits consulting, and most recently I was the executive director of the Plan Sponsor Council of America. Essentially, I've done pretty much everything. I've done a lot of work in trade associations and other industry groups. And what you need to know about me is that there's this style indicator called Gregoric. And when I took that little quiz, they scored me out as a practical dreamer. So that's essentially what I attempt to do, is bring some new innovative insights into the employee benefits marketplace.
Excellent. Well, listen, thanks for joining us. And you gave us some just great, background material coming in here. And, Ramsey and I were talking about the directions we take. And I guess, what struck us was you came up with an enormous amount of compelling reasons why an advisor should speak to their client about healthcare. But, if we sort of started, and did, what are the top 5 reasons why I, as an independent agent, should start a conversation with Mark if I'm sitting down to him talking about his healthcare, his needs to plan for healthcare?
Sure. So first up is their risk exposure is pretty significant. It is the largest expense most people have in retirement. Second thing is that there's no taxpayer-funded solution that's out there when it comes to retiree healthcare, unless you think we're going to get Medicare for all. I'm not sure that's a solution. Third, there's no taxpayer-funded government solution for long-term care insurance. Fourth is that there's really no employer-sponsored initiative out there where employers are broadly adopting retiree healthcare or long-term care employee benefit plans. And last but not least, unfortunately for a lot of us, most of the baby boom generation hasn't accumulated assets sufficient to cover these expenses, at least not the estimated costs if it were to be as a lump sum, if you will. They might be able to manage the spend on an annual basis, so long as they manage to stay out of long-term care.
Can we dig a little bit deeper on that last point, which is the the size of it. I mean, we often tend to understand, what their monthly or annual cost is of health insurance, but we talked a little bit about this prior to the show. Like, what do the numbers look like in terms of the present value of healthcare for a typical newly retired couple?
Sure. So per person at the median, 50th percentile, the annual spend right now is about $6,300 a year. So if you're a couple, that's $12,600. That's your cost as an individual. If you were to convert that into a present value, you'd need about $325,000 today to have a 90% chance to fully fund retiree healthcare costs. And if you basically end up in a nursing home or in assisted living, add in another $364,000. So we're talking about nearly $700,000 present value today for a couple age 65 today to be reasonably sure that they have enough money set aside for these expenses.
And Jack,
So we
is
have
that 1 in 3 Americans will spend some time in assisted living or need?
I think it's closer to 1 in 5 Americans by 2030 will be age 65. And I think at some point in their lives, 70% of those folks are projected to need some form of long-term services and support. Now that might be, assisted living or care in the home. It might be independent living in a facility, or it might be the very intensive nursing home care that some folks end up needing.
So Jack, these numbers are jarring, to say the least. So why isn't this at the forefront of the conversation for financial advisors, or do you have a hypothesis on that?
Well, it's something that nobody wants to talk about. Let's just start with the basics. Let's start with cognitive decline, just as a simple concept. So there's a study out done many years ago that essentially says from a financial decision-making perspective, we reach our peak as Americans at age 53 in terms of our financial decision-making capability. So when you get to that point, what you end up with is a situation where you recognize many folks that they haven't adequately prepared in terms of accumulating assets for retirement. Then you layer onto that the issue of continuing employment past what some people would think is a normal retirement age, like 65. And what you also find is that median tenure among older Americans is 10 years or less, and has been for the last 5 decades. So increasingly, whoever your employer was at age, if you're still employed full-time at age 62, increasingly, it's not the same employer you had at age 50. And so into that kind of an environment, what you end up with is people start thinking about prioritizing, what should I be paying attention to? And so they're not really thinking too much about long-term care, which, likely is something that they're going to need after essentially in their 70s or 80s potentially. And when it comes to retiree healthcare, they're hoping to work past age 65 when they would qualify for Medicare. And there's this misperception that, Medicare is going to just solve all your problems. That's why they call it Medicare for All, because they think it's a panacea, essentially, not recognizing that the average American is paying about $5,000 a year in terms of their Medicare Part B, Medicare Part D, as well as their Medicare supplement premium. Increasingly, we're going to see, because Medicare is Part A trust fund is running out of money, we're going to start to see new revenue generating activity. I don't think anybody's interested in cutting Medicare's benefits. And so as a result, what you have is an income-based additional amount for Part B and Part D that only hits a small percentage of retirees today, but it will increasingly affect more and more retirees in the future in terms of financing those costs. The other thing, one more thing, the other thing people don't recognize is that when it comes to the trust fund, that's only Part A. That's only the hospital insurance under Medicare. So the doctors and the other healthcare providers and the prescription drugs, there's no trust fund for that. Essentially, 3/4 of the cost of those particular programs are paid, the premium costs, if you will, are paid by taxpayers through general revenues. We're running $1 trillion deficits for as far as the eye can see. So when people talk about we're going to enhance Medicare, we're going to make it available to folks at age 60 and the like, there's got to be a revenue source to make that happen.
I'm kind of stuck on the net present value. I know people don't understand what the net present value is of their Social Security benefits frequently, but, and Jack, just so I got my notes, to confirm my notes, you said the net present value was roughly 325,000, right, to fund two couples, right?
To fully fund retiree medical costs, to have a 90% certainty or chance, that would be the amount.
Okay, so Mark, let's kind of think this through in terms of like what's the average FIA sale today? Is it?
Well, with us, it's about 120,000. I think in general, it's a little bit less, but I think from a immediate income standpoint of annuities, it's in the ballpark of $120,000.
Yeah. So no, I'm kind of like thinking, 325 to generate 1,200. Okay. Now there are complicated scenarios, put the money into an annuity, let it accumulate, take out, X number of years out. So the numbers are a little fuzzy, but that's about like, if I were going to fund $12,000 in expenses, yeah, 300,000, or more into annuity, kind of the numbers sort of make sense, right?
Sure.
For income guarantees. So, now tell me, am I thinking this correctly? Is that maybe on average, these annuity sales we're doing today are solving half of that healthcare problem? Is that another way to think about it?
Based on the numbers, that would make sense for sure.
So yeah, how do you fund the other half?
Right. Well, and Jack, this is also just for healthcare expenses. This is not even factoring in any long-term care needs, correct? That's an additional.
And that's correct. So what you end up with is because there is no taxpayer funded solution for retiree medical, no taxpayer funded solution for long-term care, what you end up with, and what I would advise clients to do, is to essentially make sure they approach their employer so that the employer offers the few benefit plans that and again, we're talking about potentially employee pay all, not employer costs, but employee pay all, to fund some of these expenses on a tax preferred basis. So
Hey Jack, what about you said there's no government. I mean, there's Medicaid, so certainly if folks aren't in a cohort that can afford to buy long-term care, I think some look to Medicaid as their solution potentially. I know that that there's varying opinions on that, but doesn't that play into this equation?
It does. In fact, today Medicaid pays for about 1/3 of long-term care costs. On the other hand, individuals and families pay 52% of long-term care costs, and private long-term care insurance pays less than 3%. And in fact, Medicaid,
that's fascinating.
Medicaid is actually the most likely solution for folks below the median, if you will, from an income or a wealth perspective. Unfortunately, to qualify for Medicaid, you've got to go through something they call spend down. Varies a little bit from state to state. A couple of states have much higher limits, but you basically have to essentially wear away your assets. Some exceptions, such as a home and the like. But you have to wear away your assets, and your income has to be below a certain dollar threshold. So for most folks who have essentially spent their lives working and have accumulated some assets and the like, it's typically that takes them a long time to wear away, if you will, in order to qualify for Medicaid. And on the healthcare side, there's a whole group of folks which you call dual eligible. We're eligible for Medicare, and because their income is so low that Medicaid steps in and pays their Part D and Part D premiums, as well as certain out-of-pocket expenses.
No, I personally lived through this with parents and some grandparents, which is, if you kind of did everything you were supposed to do, show up for work, save a little money, not get rich, it's whatever you thought you were going to leave to the next generation can vanish in a second. So you've got two strategies I've seen are either give everything away, 10 or more than 10 years away and go the Medicaid route, or I guess three, be healthy, pray that you don't have some mark end up in these long-term care, or third is actually do some significant planning so you've covered your funds. Mark, in terms of your perspective, how often does healthcare enter into the discussions, do you think, today in retirement planning discussions?
Yeah, I think the topic comes up in terms of something to be aware of, but I don't think that is addressed. I mean, certainly based on the stats that Jack just shared, about 3% or so being self-funded in terms of protection. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of times what I hear in the field is that by the time the conversation takes place for long-term care, it's either too late or at an age point where they view it as cost prohibitive. And I guess that would lend to the next question for Jack. Is there a sweet spot in terms of an age that somebody should really be looking at, different options available?
Well, yeah, to some extent, you're going to be on your own. So while you're employed, the best solutions are to get your employer to consider offering retiree pay-all fully insured Medicare supplement coverage. And the reason for that is because it doesn't add to the employer's liability, and it gives you one more option in terms of financing that with tax preferred dollars. The other thing you need to do is to approach your employer, if you don't already have access to it, is to request that they adopt a active employee healthcare coverage that's HSA capable, health savings account capable, because not only are those Medicare premiums eligible expenses, but so are the long-term care insurance premiums, and both Medicare or medical as well as long-term care out-of-pocket costs. So you can, I'll use myself as an example. I've been an HSA participant since 2005. Between my spouse and myself, we have HSA assets accumulated of over $100,000. One of the nice things about HSAs is they have the same investment choices as individual retirement accounts. And so that would include, for example, annuity.
Will, from a compliance standpoint, if I sat down with a client and I made healthcare planning, I'm an annuity agent, I'm going to make healthcare funding planning sort of core tenet of my practice, what are the issues I need to think about if annuities are a big part of the funding strategy? Are there third rails? Are there things I need to be concerned about as I'm talking about the solutions?
Well, I think, and I'll use myself as an example. When I was a financial advisor, we sold long-term care to people. We talked about it. It was a critical component of our overall discussion, and we were appropriately licensed to offer long-term care. Actually, I sold long-term care to my parents in the early 60s. They hate writing the check, and so it was I think any kind of individual who holds himself out as a financial planner, which we did, isn't looking holistically if they're not having the conversations about everything that we talk about on this show. We've talked about income. Income is definitely a theme of certain annuities, but this, even just from what we've been talking about initially and what Jack laid out, the amount of individuals, only 3%, I think, as Mark confirmed, that are actually privately funding through some type of long-term care their long-term care needs, shows that either there's an affordability issue, there's a lack of engagement in that regard. But I don't think that, I think that anyone who is looking at a comprehensive situation for individuals' retirement should be having a conversation across the board, not one-dimensional. And I think you have to be sure, certainly sure that you're licensed if you're going to sell things, and et cetera. So, and that you're clear and that you're disclosing everything and that you're not, bundling things. And we've talked a little bit about, some annuities have components for care, but certainly they're not, qualified long-term care. So those are types of pitfalls that I think advisors just have to be clear as to what it is they're talking about. But any kind of comprehensive fact find should include an evaluation of projected healthcare needs, any kind of Monte Carlo simulation. We all talk a lot about, you got to have this bucket of money, whatever it fluctuates, 1.8 million or 2 million or whatever it is for retirement. And hopefully that number is inclusive of what Jack's laid out as a net present value of 300,000, in excess of 300,000, not including, long-term care. So I'd say it should be game and it should be part of the conversation.
Ramsey, on the DIA SPIA front, I mean, how often have healthcare conversations come in when you've been talking to either individuals or RIAs about, using immediate incomes for funding healthcare?
I mean, it's just discussed in a very generalized way. The idea being that that a DIA or SPIA, at least in terms of the way we think about it, is really designed to cover non-discretionary expenses. So that would include, in addition to food and basic housing expenses, it would include some measure of health insurance. So it does go into the calculus to sort of figure out, well, what is the gap between existing sources of guaranteed income and non-discretionary expenses? The question as to whether or not those expenses are accurately forecast is another one. So when I talk to financial planners, or when I talk to clients that don't have financial planners, usually, one of my main sort of initial concerns is, have you figured out, what a reasonable forecast of, the arc of those expenses will be going forward? And obviously this is a very important component of them. But I want to shift gears a little bit, because Jack, you said on more than one occasion that the solution is to go to your employer and ask them for these things, whether it's a plan that's fully employee funded, but I guess benefits from the sort of the better bargaining power of a company doing it, as opposed to an individual finding that plan themselves, or HSAs. And the question that pops up in my head, though, is that one is, how much leverage does a single employee have to go to their employer and ask them to do that if they haven't already done it? And in a world where many people are working in the gig economy, or even if they have an employer, get their health benefits, for example, through the ACA, like what are the options here? I mean, we're in a world where companies have actually, as much as possible, been moving away from providing benefits. And so, what are the solutions outside of going to your employer, in your view?
Sure. So I'm not talking about the employer increasing their spend on healthcare coverage. I'm talking about the employer leveraging the tax code and reducing their spend. And one of the things that perhaps financial advisors could do is incorporate some information about these, whether you want to call it a glossy or something else, that essentially highlights the value to not just the retiree or the employee, future retiree, but also to her or his employer. The value is monies contributed, for example, to a health savings account, typically go in through a cafeteria plan, which means that they avoid employment taxes. And as we know, should Mr. Biden become president, he's planning on essentially over a certain dollar amount, reapplying, if you will, the full 7.65% for Social Security and Medicare, both the employee and the employer. HSAs also form this great tax-preferred executive benefit as well. A lot of executives are capped out in terms of what they can contribute to their employer-sponsored 401k plan. I think right now, if you're old and gray like me, if you're over age 50, it's $26,000 a year. That's nice, but it's not enough. If you were to adopt the HSA capable option and the executive, let's say, is also married, and put another 7,000 plus. And if they're over 55, essentially $9,000 a year. The whole point is to take advantage of the tax preferences. Otherwise, this is just a, kind of like a Fram oil filter commercial question. Pay me now or pay me later. And that's one last thing to keep in mind, is that both retiree healthcare coverage, long-term care insurance, those things are in effect legacy insurance. They're essentially, if you want to leave money to your survivors, that's one of the reasons why you would pursue these tax efficient methods and lowering your cost to deliver this value. With an HSA, there's never any waste. There's nothing that's ever forfeited. If you're lucky enough not to have any long-term care expense, or you're unlucky enough to die early, so you didn't burn it all up on Medicare premiums, it goes to your spouse or any other tax dependents. And if you don't have any of those, it goes to your named beneficiary. So there's a legacy value in this as well, and very tax efficient accumulation, more tax efficient than your 401k. And so I think if we were to approach financial advisors and essentially lay out what I would call a turnkey solution, here's how you can approach your employer and make this available. Again, an HSA is an individually owned trust, like an IRA. I think there's a great opportunity there. One last thing, while 25% of Americans who have active employee healthcare coverage have access to an HSA capable option, a substantial minority of them actually select that choice. And of those who contribute or have an HSA account, less than 5% of them and actually invest that money. So they're not taking advantage of the tax deferral and tax-free nature of the health savings account. I think that if we were to identify this, I think that the employers would find this to have significant value, not just to the employees, but to them. And I guess the other way of saying this is that if people are financially prepared to retire when they reach, let's say, age 65, the reality is we all know the cost of healthcare goes up significantly as you get older, and that the rules are such that Medicare is still primary Medicare secondary, if you're still working when you're 65. So there's an opportunity for the employer to lower their expense to the extent people are prepared for retirement.
It's interesting, Jack. So you're pointing out an avenue that exists through HSAs to fund them to a certain level, that you're essentially putting money away for medical expenses after retirement or after you separate from your employer, in a manner similar to people funding their 401k.
Yeah, and you can invest those assets in an annuity if you believe that kind of a stream return. Obviously, in terms of a payout, it would just stay inside the HSA until and move from the annuity to another, to the extent you had an income annuity, move to another investment inside the HSA. And you would want to accumulate it. It continues to accumulate tax deferred, so that when you do have expenses, you can go ahead and claim them and not have to pay any taxes on those monies. So they go in pre-tax, they accumulate tax deferred, and they come out tax-free. Unlike the 401k, they go in pre-tax also for employment taxes, not just for federal and state income tax purposes.
Yeah, I think that's helpful for if financial advisors or agents are listening to this podcast, to have that conversation with individuals who are still working.
No, absolutely. Use everything available in the workplace before you leave it, I think is a great piece of advice. Wow, this is what an uplifting conversation. I can't wait to get old and need healthcare. So Jack, I probably already know the answer, because I tell you, it's as we all know, it's exceptionally easy to criticize everything that's wrong with our healthcare system. Good luck to somebody who sticks their head out and tries to fix it. What is your association's perspective or your personal perspective on, the opportunity for change? Obviously election year, who wins, who doesn't? do you foresee any major policy changes in the next couple of years as a result of either outcome for the presidential election?
Well, I only know what I read as well, and I know that right now America supposedly spends 18% of GDP on healthcare. Last I looked, in my undergrad in economics, I learned how to calculate, then it was called GNP, now we only limited to domestic GDP. And I noticed that GDP far exceeds, for example, net national income. So if we're spending about 18% of GDP on healthcare, that means we're probably spending about 22% of net national income or personal income. Certainly after tax income, much more than that, to the extent it's not tax preferred. I don't have a 20% deduction on my paycheck. I doubt you guys do either. My point is that we're already, spending a ton of money on healthcare. So, until we don't look for somebody else to shoulder the burden, I think Americans, many Americans want the best healthcare coverage your money will buy. And so as we continue to try to shift this burden onto somebody else, future generations, which is what we've kind of done for Medicare, I think sooner or later, that bill's going to come due. So my suggestion, I think you'll see lots of initiatives. People will say we can afford to do this or we can afford to do that. I think we'd have a lot more success if we essentially kind of cut it up a little bit. Here's what you should be called upon to finance as an individual. Maybe here's what your employer should be called upon to pay. And here are those expenses, those really significant expenses that really call out for a societal solution. Keep in mind that 5% of Americans, 10% of Americans incur about 80% of the medical costs every year. That's a different group every year, but that's really the fact. And it's that group that's incurring the largest amount of expenses that I think if we all decided that we could live with a societal solution, I think that all of us as individuals or through our employers, we can handle the other 20, 25% of the cost. So that's my solution. That's not necessarily my employer's solution. And we really don't hang out too much on the healthcare side. We really hang out on the retirement side. And as we've talked about, healthcare expenses are a significant component of why we encourage people to accumulate assets for retirement, whether that's through your K plan or your pension plan or your health savings account.
Paul, you mentioned something, and Jack, that's really helpful perspective that this is uplifting conversation, but it's necessary. And it's, we like to talk, I think, in this industry or across the board as, like the prospects of a, fruitful retirement and travel and, grandkids and all these other things. And then there's this other component that we're talking about right now that isn't as enjoyable of a conversation, but critical.
No, absolutely, and I'll second that. It gives me pause to think a lot about how we're some of the resources we're putting at the fingertips of agents. This might be something that's worth spending more time. So, yeah, Jack, first of all, thanks so much for your time. Ramsey, Will, Mark, any final questions or thoughts for Jack? Okay,
I think just a quick comment. I think it's a very important topic, and essentially, you're highlighting that one, it needs to be part of the conversation. Two, we all need to focus on trying to prepare for these costs in a tax efficient way, and there are tools available to us to do that. If your employer does not provide such tools, you should ask for them. And overall, like, again, keeping this as part of the planning process is just super important. So much appreciated for bringing your perspective.
And I guess
yeah, same thing. Go ahead, Mark.
I was going to say one comment from my perspective is, number one, education is obviously the key, as we've talked about in all of our programs. Client awareness, preparedness is really what's going to help solve the problems. I think a great opportunity for agents in terms of engagement with clients is if you think about the average annuity buyer today at age 65, what a great opportunity to start a conversation with clients, while they're still in the workforce. Get those client acquisitions going early on, educate the clients, get them prepared so that when they are ready for retirement, you've already got them as a client. And then you can solve other solutions for them as well. So I think it's a great way to start a conversation, help educate individuals, and really build out your businesses.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Really appreciated your perspective and some of the statistics and information that you shared with us. I said earlier were jarring, but I do think that they're very, very important. Given we've all talked about the absence of pensions and the mortality and the duration of years people will spend in retirement and needing healthcare as well as income for other reasons. So this is great conversation and necessary. So
yeah, again, Jack, thanks for joining us. And where can people, one, find out more about, or find more of what you've written, and how can they access work that's the American Retirement Association does?
Sure. So you can find me on LinkedIn. Again, Jack Towarnicky. You see my name listed there, I think, on the screen. I'm the only one on LinkedIn as far as I know. Feel free to connect with me, and more than happy to provide all this different background information. And if you really want to develop a kind of like a turnkey approach on your clients reaching out to their employers in terms of the value of a health savings account or employer-sponsored, fully insured retiree pay-all Medicare supplement or Medicare complement coverage, I'm available to help you with that. No charge, no fees. It's just, I think that it's something that I'd like to see more Americans adopt health savings accounts and prepare for this expense in retirement. So you can find me on LinkedIn. It's my email address is jacktowarnicky@gmail.com. No bullets, no hyphens or anything, just one word.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, we'll put all the contacts in the show notes. But Jack, thanks. Ramsey, Mark, Will, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for joining us. And like us, subscribe us, send links to your friends. And we'll look forward to speaking with all of you next week for another episode of That Annuity Show.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please rate and recommend us on iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also get more information at thatannuityshow.com.